In a strange and curious tale, someone has absconded from the multiverse with the music of the spheres, determined to flatten the many layers and worlds of creativity and fiction that humanity has developed over millennia, and turn it into one song with one voice, monotonous and unchanging forever. Curious figures from the world of fiction, from novels, plays, and the world of myth and legend. Can they work together to prevent this destruction of not only their worlds, but all worlds, brought together for what should be an exciting journey through a multiverse?
A little over 1 year later. Welcome to Niche Retelling, the podcast where we explore all the ways old tales are made new. I am your host, Jasmine Garcia, and once again we are doing another special Worlds Elsewhere related episode. Joining me today are...
Your forever GM, Conor Duffy.
I have no more guilt than you, Justin Bailey, who played Jean Valjean.
The person who played Morgan Le Fay, and also in the perpetual role that I love so much as his lovely wife, Katie Duffy.
It is Burlig, and I am Addie, and I played Alice.
I am Sam Marchioni, the mistress of my own actions, and I played Christine Daae.
I'm Ellie. I played Titania, and I'm on 4 hours of sleep, so I didn't prepare a quote.
And I am Alana Greenberg-Sood, and I played the first goddess, as well as being on the production side.
And I was fortunate enough to play the Sweet Witch from Hansel and Gretel. And I believe I said in my email when it was first offered to me, you guys spoil me. But yeah.
Shout out to Bex and Laura.
Yeah,
I didn't spoil you. I cooked you just right.
I was going to cook you.
Alice cooked you.
Yeah, Alice very much did, yes. But we'll get into that. But yes, we are going to be discussing the Worlds Elsewhere actual play Musica, Universalis.
The brainchild of Mr. Conor Duffy.
So Conor, obviously I feel like we should start off with you just kind of explaining Musica Universalis in your own words, you know, how you pitched it.
Well, it began life as a joke from a random post from a message board many, many years ago. And I always thought it would be kind of funny to run a one-shot based on this idea. When I first started thinking about it, was essentially Albert Einstein, Jimi Hendrix, William Shakespeare, and Jesus all live on an interdimensional craft fueled by the dreams of children and travel through the multiverse, righting wrongs and solving problems. And many years passed, and I became intrigued by the concept of public domain characters. You know, these were, characters from all forms of media that for whatever reason fell into the public domain, whether it be, the copyright came to an end or the author purposefully placed a character in the public domain or what have you, or in the case of something like Night of the Living Dead, a simple accident of how they laid out their credits almost immediately put the movie into the public domain. And I was very interested in the idea of taking characters like that who kind of got tossed to the wind, and what could you do with those characters? How could you take them and do something interesting with them? And, how could you maybe examine the concept of being like this character that anyone can do anything with? And recently, as someone who has always had a love for cinema and love for storytelling, it's become very apparent that the process of creating art and the process of selling a product, which used to go hand in hand in the world of Western cinema, have drifted apart. And with the amalgamation of entertainment entities, desire to sell the product has superseded any desire to create art. Characters are reused, copyrights are extended to their breaking limit. So when the opportunity to pitch an idea for a one-shot to kind of raise funds for Worlds Elsewhere and also act as a sort of crossover between Worlds Elsewhere Theatre Company and Fantasy Worlds Elsewhere came along, once I kind of put all of those random ideas together into a mixture and decided that this was probably the only opportunity I was ever going to have to run this one shot and to state in a very blunt manner my feelings about the commodification of art and the importance of allowing characters to slip into the public domain so that we could tell new and interesting stories with them, and also have a metatextual sort of examination of it as well. The players all play characters who come from myth and legend or stage plays or novels, but ultimately, you know, how real or fictional those characters are, you know, what their origins might be, doesn't really matter. For the purposes of the game, their characters are all fictional. And I wondered, how would a person respond if you told them that all of the years of suffering that they had experienced, or all of these strange adventures that they had gone on, everyone that they had ever loved or lost, all of their enemies and friends, what if they were to learn that their very existence was purpose-made for the entertainment of beings that exist beyond their understanding, who create entire worlds, entire universes within their imagination, and then place people, fully realized individuals with loves and hates and hopes and dreams and fears, place them into those universes that are created inside this being's imagination, and then are very often run through the ringer before they either succeed or, just as often, fail miserably. How would you respond if something came along and told you, we've been playing with your character for centuries and it's been fun. Oh, and now you need to do something for us, because if you don't, the existence that you are, that we made, it will cease to be. Go.
It is a hell of a story idea.
Yeah, in so many words, that's where it comes from.
Pretty much as soon as I realized there was something along those lines, I was so excited. Pretty much as soon as I saw the teaser, I was. And Alana, I believe you had something to say about what excited you about this when it was first pitched to you.
Yeah, thank you. So I am the artistic director at Worlds Elsewhere, which means I am the gatekeeper about what things we produce. And Fantasy Worlds Elsewhere formed when a bunch of people who had met through Worlds Elsewhere started playing tabletop games together and decided they wanted to play them as actual play for an audience. And they've got their own stuff, which is awesome, which they can talk about at the end. But this was going to be the second year that we were going to kind of do a soft open to our season by doing a collaboration with them, where the players were all people that were in Fui most of the time, and then some of the NPCs would be played by guest actors from Worlds Elsewhere, which we've managed to keep secrets from, like, spouses on that one as to who is going to appear as NPCs, so that's fun. And so, you know, it was late fall. I went to the Fui contingent and I said, okay, gang, do you want to do this again? And what do you have in mind? And Connor presented me with this idea, which I loved right off the bat, because if for no other reason, Worlds Elsewhere is also in part about the commodification of art, because we started when a whole bunch of people who were friends and connected to the YouTuber Kyle Kalgren, everybody who acted for a living, and many YouTubers were suddenly out of work because of COVID or couldn't do their jobs the way they normally did, and like it was affecting people's income and it was affecting people's ability to make art. And the original idea was, let's find a way to make art virtually. And then a little later we decided, hey, while we're at it, let's do some charity work as well. And so some of our shows are charity shows, and our first collab we did to benefit Amnesty International, and then last year was to benefit Worlds Elsewhere. But this one, Musica, the idea that live theater is now so expensive most of the time that your average person can't go to the theater, and the fact that it's, for some people, it's more about saying, oh, I went to New York City and I saw a play on Broadway. What did they say? They don't care. You don't have to love theater to be a good person or an interesting conversationalist or whatever, but the idea that a theater ticket you spend multiple hundreds of dollars on is the prize itself, not the experience of going to the theater, is kind of, to me, is, and I know to a greater or lesser extent to some of the other folks at Worlds Elsewhere, that's kind of sad. And then the idea was also just to keep busy. And one of the things that we deal with a lot at Worlds Elsewhere, we do a lot of works from the public domain. Obviously, we pull from Shakespeare because who doesn't? And like we're named after a quote from Coriolanus and everything. But the ability to perform plays is drastically hindered by the way that copyright works. Not because copyright is a bad thing, because copyright is a good thing, because people should be paid for the work that they do. But you have middlemen who are responsible for licensing the shows, and they often have very strict requirements about how you can perform their shows and how you can make changes to the genders or races, sometimes even, which is especially horrific in my opinion. Or you're not allowed to record the show and put it up online, which, considering that that's what Worlds Elsewhere does, it is a great hindrance. There is a play that we did that I will not name, but you can figure it out if you look at our website, where we got permission to do the show virtually from the playwright before the licensing company said, okay, yeah, fine, you can do it online. And the licensing company was like, you can't change the genders of any of the characters, and you can't cut or change any lines or anything like that. But on literally the first page of the script, under the name of the show and who owned it and all of that stuff, was a note from the playwright written into the script saying, this play is about using your imagination, so if you have ideas to play with this show and change it and make it more meaningful to you, run with it, which is highly contradictory. And so when Conor comes to me with this idea where the bad guy is someone who is trying to shape all of creative thought to one form, I was like, oh my god, yes, absolutely, this sounds like a perfect fit for Worlds Elsewhere as a collab with Fui, because like one of the things about doing actual play stuff is that you got to be careful to see whether, if you're using a module that someone else wrote, can you actually play it online. And for those who are less familiar with some of the drama that went on with Dungeons and Dragons, they're owned by Hasbro, who didn't want people like Critical Role and Dimension 20 and stuff making money off of Dungeons and Dragons anymore without them getting a slice. And there was all this drama with this that happened, I believe, after this production, but it just kind of fit with the whole like creativity being confined by corporate entities. And so I was like, yes, I would absolutely love to provide the platform to play this. And then I got to be a nominally antagonistic character, and so that was really fun. But yeah, Worlds Elsewhere, when I ran it past the rest of the directors, they were all like, yes, no, this is great, this is gonna be awesome. Conor is an experienced GM, and so I basically said, whatever you need from me, and let him run, and it was awesome.
That it was. And so now I kind of want to turn into our player characters. So I'm guessing Conor kind of just reached out to you to join him with this project. So tell me a little bit about how you decided which character you were going to bring in and what perspective you were going for there. And
I might have been like the very first person. The minute Conor put this out in the Fui Discord, I was immediately typing Christine Daae, I'm gonna be Christine Daae. Because if you know me from my previous appearances on IER, or you watched my videos on La Femme Fictionale, or you, in the way past, saw my attempts as a 17-year-old to copy the Lizzie Bennet diaries, which I then took off the internet because I realized, oh, I put videos of myself on the internet while I was underage, and now people are being creepy about it. The point is, Christine Daae is a character who is very near and dear to my heart, and I especially love her in LaRue's original book because she's so much more engaging and interesting and active a character than the doe-eyed damsel in distress that a lot of people think of her as. She is not your self-insert bodice ripper heroine. And so when Conor pitched this, I was super excited. I was like, I think Christine would look at all the shit that's been done with her story and be like, well, actually, maybe a single thing isn't so bad. So I had that idea of the journey for her to realize, no, I need the variety because there's the bad, but there's also the good.
I forget the exact sequence of events, like obviously I was involved, but I forget when I knew of it. Sort of in a similar way, my mind more or less immediately went to doing Valjean. Around this time, I had been going through older literature because just the nature of my work, I can listen to audiobooks and the like, so I was trying to find a way to fill the void of a very monotonous job. And I had listened to the musical, a lot of people have, and I've always been interested in Valjean. I wanted to include him in this sort of narrative because this narrative, as Conor said, is pulling a character out of their context and saying your struggles are pointless. And in the history of, Western literature, who has suffered more and has brought themselves to suffer somewhat pointlessly than Valjean. He, buckles down and forces himself through a lot of situations that are pretty awful, just because he feels guilty, right? And from that basis, I sort of worked out the character from there. Like, obviously, we're using a RPG system, and it was sort of working with that system and going back and forth with Conor about, based off of what he can do in the book, would it be reasonable for a character like Valjean to be capable of? Like, obviously, he is incredibly strong, like a lot of other Hugo characters. He has this incredible empathy. He has this history of crime, and I don't know if Conor directly picked it up, but the first location being the Chateau Dif from Count of Monte Cristo was related to that, where I had always felt that these two stories would have an interesting connection because of how differently Dantes and Valjean sort of deal with their experiences in prison.
I have to say, the moment I realized that Dantes was going to be involved in this, Alana can tell you, I was flipping out in the NPC group.
Originally, we were thinking 5 NPCs and wound up going with 4, and Dantes was originally going to be played by an actor, but we couldn't find somebody. Conor and I couldn't find somebody that was available and fit and was interested in doing improv like this and whatever, and so Conor played Dantes. But I was just looking at the list of NPCs, lining up which ones fit against which characters in my head, which is pretty fun.
Yeah, and you're right. The idea of these two characters that kind of came from similar places but went on to handle it so differently. It was just fascinating watching them interact, especially when I came to realize, they are coming into conflict. No, but I want them both to. No. So I'm glad that ended up resolving peacefully.
One of the things I appreciated about that was Justin as Valjean approaching that with a great sense of empathy and also with a great degree of conviction, which was a wonderful approach to the conflict that would inevitably arise from those two characters meeting. I'm not 100% sure when I figured out exactly stories I was going to utilize over the course of the game, but I knew that I wanted each act to go further backwards in time, so that way we found ourselves moving through the evolution of storytelling. So that's why we begin with the Count of Monte Cristo, and then we go basically all the way back to the beginning, the first stories of why does X happen? And well, it must be because of the gods. Moving even further beyond that, I was very taken by that interaction so early in the game. It was one of the reasons why I chose the Fate RPG system to run this game, because I wanted a system that could support narrative gameplay that still had enough structure to it that you could ask to do something and there would essentially be a role you could make to do it, while at the same time getting out of the way when it wasn't needed. And also, primarily, it meant that you could undertake conflicts like that in a non-violent manner. I run a lot of D&D and similar types of games, and while I do enjoy those systems for what they are ultimately about getting into physical fights in order to gain experience and or better equipment. But I do want to say I appreciated how each player embraced the system and embraced what they could do within that system. It's not easy to throw a bunch of people a website or an SRD and say, this is what I'm going to be running it in, and you have, about a month to figure out the intricacies on top of, the life that you're currently living. But I think that everyone rose to the occasion, and it enhanced the experience of running this game immensely.
I wanted to first say that I had not noticed when playing that we were going backwards in time to earlier and earlier stories. It didn't really occur to me to think about it on that axis, but that is so cool. I love how it ended up playing anyway, but it was a great time. So I played Alice, and I was trying to keep as close to an Alice that might have been the Alice from the books as possible, with the slight exception that it's not 100% clear in the original book that she actually went anywhere or that it was all in her imagination. So my Alice definitely went somewhere, and Wonderland likes her. But originally I had a couple of different ideas before I settled pretty quickly on Alice, and I think all of them could have been a ton of fun. One of them was Hedda Gabler, just realizing that if she's a story, then all of the social pressures that kept her contained don't matter, and she can go apeshit.
Like she didn't already?
Like she didn't already, right. But obviously it would be like a gunslinger type character, very, very different. If it's all just a story and nobody matters, then why should she care about appearing to be polite and demure and being controlled? There's no reason for that. So that would be just an entirely different axis to go on. And I also had brainworms about a Catherine Heathcliff kind of duality that was one person, because Catherine truly believes that she is Heathcliff by the end of Wuthering Heights.
All my thoughts, all my actions are for him.
Yeah, that would have been also really fun and also a wildly different direction. But in the end, I wanted to do this petulant, picky child who has a ton of imagination, is very curious, is very clever, and often acts before she's really thought too hard about a thing, and then gets frustrated when she's confused. Because I enjoyed the idea of just being able to essentially go pure id whenever I'm presented with a problem. And so one of my favorite moments in the show was when she decided how to react to the Sweet Witch, which took all of 10 seconds for me to be like, I'm gonna mess everything up right now. And I did not know, because it was going to be dependent on the dice, right? I did not know how that was going to work out, but it was just pure impulse, no control.
Alice said, R.I.P. to Hansel and Gretel, but I'm different.
Yes. Although I did end up cooking her, so I suppose in that way we're similar.
That is true, but you defeated the Sweet Witch much faster than Hansel and Gretel did, and yeah, did not expect that, and we'll definitely go into the surprises that came up in the midst of this.
One other thing, I just want to add that in the first section that when Connor was talking about the story, you said that you weren't sure if you were ever going to get another chance to play this particular idea of a module. If you ever want to do another version of this, or with historical characters or pretty much anything, I would play anything with you.
Ditto.
Anytime. For any reason. So
Moi aussi.
You can do whatever you want. I'm game.
but also we don't want to make you forever GM.
That is also true.
True.
Thank you very much.
Of course.
So when Connor first was talking about this concept that he had and what he was putting together, I was intrigued, but I also didn't want to end up falling into the role of ... and the DM's wife is here because she's married to him. So I originally was not, I was encouraging, but I was like, I'm happy to jump in if you want me to jump in. If you have people who are already ready to go, like, don't worry about it. I can just spend a few hours quietly doing something in another part of the house. But I was invited. And when he was talking about the very first idea I had was Ozma, who comes from The Wizard of Oz. And I don't know why I thought about that. I think I was going for like somebody, a little bit, obviously public domain, but a little bit more esoteric. But I backed away from that rather quickly because I realized I didn't really know much about Ozma and did not have time to, mainline the Wizard of Oz universe. So I decided to look a little bit further back. And I've always been interested in medieval history and medieval literature. I was thinking about the Arthurian myths, and I could do Guinevere, but Guinevere's been done to death. I could do Morgan Le Fay, but she's also been done to death. But I came back and I kept thinking over and over again about that character because we have an idea in popular culture that Morgan Le Fay is an evil sorceress, full stop. She does not have many redeeming qualities except if you read The Mists of Avalon, although due to, we'll just say, controversy with that author.
To say the least.
Yes, I have decided that I do not want to engage with those books. But the stereotype is evil, conniving, manipulative sorceress. But if you look back at the source material, which I did, she did not start out that way. And I do not have proof of this, but there's a series on YouTube, Terry Jones's Medieval Lives, and it's a fantastic series. It was originally on British television, but it's all about kind of like debunking myths that we have about what life was actually like in the Middle Ages. And one of the episodes is called The Damsel, and he provides actual historical evidence. We have kind of a skewed idea of what medieval women were actually like. Medieval women, and not just nobles, but, commoners, they were very dynamic. They were business owners. They often were in charge of their husband's estate. If their husband had enough money or enough prestige, within the noble line to have that kind of land, they would often be put in charge of the estate, including defending it. There's a great record of a woman writing to her husband who's, I think, in London petitioning the king. And she's like, while you're there, can you pick up some sugar? We need some flour. Oh, and crossbows. We need more crossbows and bolts to go with those crossbows. Crossbows, thank you. And so I looked into Morgan Le Fay and found out that, she was tricky. She did use magic, but she was not necessarily evil. She's kind of morally gray in the stories. And so, how did we go from somebody who, depending on what source you're looking at, was like a great healer? She was like, the head of this group of sisters who existed on Avalon. How do we go from that to the pop sorceress? And the answer is the Victorians, because the Victorians loved them some medieval history and medieval stories, but they kind of had a problem with this whole women's agency thing. They were not fans, and so you can rewrite Guinevere a bit more and make her be, this chaste and holy woman who is given to passion with Lancelot, and the great tragedy of how her desiring another man brings about the end of Camelot. But you can't really do that with Morgan Le Fay. And so the only answer they had was, strong-willed woman who wants to do things her own way. She must be kind of morally degenerate, so we'll just kind of make her a villain in a lot of these retellings that we're going to create. And it's something that's kind of been carried forward ever since. And when Connor came with the idea of, what would this character do if they found out everything that's happened to you, and in this particular case, in this particular story that we told, Morgan Le Fay finding out or being either informed or being aware of all of these various permutations. What would you do if you found out that this was all because people were playing essentially paper dolls, fifth dimensional beings playing paper dolls? And my answer was she'd just be really angry. She'd just storm through all of it and be like, okay, if this is all for somebody's personal amusement, then they're gonna find out right away that they messed with the wrong woman, because guess what? I can shapeshift and you can't.
Yeah, wow, the Victorians doing something sexist and awful to a woman with agency? I'm truly, truly shocked. Yeah.
Who would have thought
And yeah, that was like one of the things that did surprise me, because I also haven't really looked that much into Arthurian legend. We discussed this in the Green Knight episode. So it is actually really interesting to know that this famous villain was never really like that.
So when this concept was originally pitched to me, like, Fantasy Worlds Elsewhere was originally just based off a one-shot that I planned on doing for charity, Macbeth, which happened approximately 1 trillion years ago. And anyone who's played a TTRPG with me kind of knows that, like, we go through this process of like, okay, Ellie, we've got your original character concept. Now, can you make it so that I don't feel like I have to call the police on you? I end up with either very dark or very out there concepts. For instance, my original concept for my character, which I didn't share with anyone for reasons that will become clear in a minute, was a tie-in with our first charity stream where I was going to play Lady Macbeth, with the twist that I had in my head being she thinks she's in hell, and so she's sabotaging the rest of the team because she thinks she deserves to be here.
Oh, that would be so cool, though.
I know, but
That would have been rad.
I thought it was a really good idea, but I'm very nervous about doing PvP in TTRPGs. I think PvP is the raddest shit in the world in TTRPGs, but I find that people take it extremely personally, and I didn't want to, like, risk that happening on stream when people realize, like, oh my god, Ellie's been fucking with us this entire time. I dropped that pretty quick. I couldn't figure out how to do that in a way that would read well, and I also couldn't really figure out what Lady Macbeth's powers would be, so I just kind of dropped that. My second concept was Laura from Carmilla. As anyone who's listened to this podcast regularly knows, I'm a really big fan of Carmilla, but I don't recall what exactly caused me to drop that. I think we kind of got into the ethics of desiring the monster back, and I kind of just like, I'm not going to walk into that minefield for a charity stream. And so I wound up playing Titania. Like, I originally rejected Titania in my head because I figured, like, we're going to have, like, 5 different Shakespeare characters. I need to look outside that box. And then we didn't. And then I was the only one. So I'm still not super happy with how I played Titania. I was extremely scared of, like, being a Venn diagram with Morgan Le Fay. And I was also extremely scared of, like, if Titania's power is functionally limitless, how do I not, like, Superman and just instantly solve every problem? So I kind of just, like, sat very far back and let everyone else handle stuff. But I've always been very attracted to phase stories because I feel like the pressures of writing in D&D or whatever TTRPG you're playing, of playing a character whose morality is extremely rigid but completely alien. I play a lot of fairies and a lot of fae in general, and again, it's one of those kind of like minefields of myself as a player where I have to be like, you can understand that you are playing this character who is disconnected from human morality. You have to also play with these other people, so you have to put a lid on that. You can write this however you want when you're alone writing a story, but you have to like engage with the problem and sit back, let other people have their scenes, sit back, not instantly like murder the bad guy because that's what the fae person would do. So I've never been entirely happy with how I played Titania, but I think that she was just like interesting as someone who existed on a different level from everyone else and just kind of wanted to be done with this whole thing. I feel like the stuff that I liked the best was when she was feeling like she was being bound by humans' imagination of her, which is one of those things I always get very annoyed when I feel like, how do I put this? There's a broad concept that has been bound into a very tight box, and that happens a lot with stories. That happens with a lot of concepts. And I think that I probably would have done better in a longer play session with Titania, but I think that I did pretty well under the circumstances, even if I'm not satisfied with it. Don't take me not being satisfied with it as like criticism of anyone. The list of things that I've done that I've been completely satisfied with consists of, I'm pretty happy with transitioning.
I knew that was where it was going to go.
Hell yeah. I don't know. I enjoyed watching your Titania. However, I will say, Sam, can you imagine Christine and Laura interacting with that premise, though?
I think Christine probably would have been too traumatized to go on an adventure with Laura, especially given what happened with Christine in the first scene when we meet the author. Mm-hmm. Like, I loved doing that scene, but if you had that scene and then Christine has to go on an adventure with someone who's like, yeah, loving the monster is actually great, and she's like, but my trauma!
Well, that was sort of the other realization I came to, and I think that you and I need to, like, start either playing more D&D together or play less, because we keep picking characters that are parallels to each other. Because both Lady Macbeth and Laura would be very strong parallels to Christine.
Yeah.
The answer is more D&D. I always want to play more with you.
Laura, in my conception of her, had the monster, had the Phantom in Christine's story, or her version of the Phantom, coming after her and went, yeah, I'm into that. Whereas Lady Macbeth went down that path of evil and wants to be punished for it. So I think, whereas, Christine, I feel like her thing was like coming down to saying, no, you didn't deserve any of that. You have to get better. I think both of those would have been a very interesting interaction with Christine. I was kind of like wandering into some major minefields there, as I often do. And that is not me saying that I had to tone down a character. Again, that is not a criticism on anyone in this group. I come up with an incredibly out there concept that makes complete sense to me, and then I have to like make it fit into a group. That's just the way I am.
It's unfortunate that we weren't able to get some of the other guest actors here, but we also had, I think I even asked like the day of, where did the Squeaky Knight thing come from? I'm not familiar with that story. I hadn't heard it before.
It's a poem called The Knight Whose Armor Didn't Squeak by A.A. Milne, the creator of Winnie the Pooh. That piece of work and that character entered the public domain the same year we did Musica Universalis. So Sir Thomas Tom had literally just entered the public domain, and it was important for me anyway to make sure that I included a public domain character that had literally just entered the public domain, basically within a couple of months. And Sir Thomas Tom seemed like the perfect kind of character to pop into this incredibly serious and dark fictional prison, to have this character kind of land in there essentially as a form of comic relief. Because part of the idea was, as stories were being flattened, as fiction was being meddled with by this thief of the music of the spheres, the fictional worlds were colliding with each other in ways that did not make a ton of sense. And so we're getting drawn backwards and forwards through time.
Let's talk a bit about the other NPCs. What kind of went into the process of getting an idea of who you wanted? Because I remember when you spoke with me about me kind of building the Sweet Witch character, you had mentioned the Frankenstein's monster was originally in the running.
Yeah, I had a number of different concepts in mind for the NPC characters. Eventually, I kind of settled into the idea that I had of making sure that as the player characters moved through these fictional worlds, they also kind of moved through the history of fiction. So to place Sir Thomas Tom, who was like a 20th century character, essentially into the world of the Count of Monte Cristo, then you get an opportunity then to examine sort of the period of time when the concept of the novel was in full swing and was becoming popular in that concept. Like stories were getting gathered together in novels basically and presented and sold later on in that format. The reason behind the Sweet Witch was it allowed me to kind of like bounce even further back. We went into the world of Elizabethan theatre through the work of The Tempest, with the players meeting Prospera in this iteration and dealing with basically a monster. I was interested in the idea of presenting a monster that had a certain sympathetic air about them. In the story of Hansel and Gretel, the witch is in no way a sympathetic character as we know it in the Grimm fairy tale. But those fairy tales, again, they come from somewhere else. They come from an older tradition of storytelling. So you have, again, a situation of like an older form of story creeping into a newer form of storytelling, getting infected with this old form. And because the Grimm fairy tales were simply one iteration of a story that had been told countless times for who knows how long in those folk traditions, you had an opportunity to kind of play with the idea of, well, why is this character like this? Why does she live in this home composed of the finest sweets, and the only thing that can sustain her is essentially humans? That is what she feasts off. And I will say, to sort of heap praise upon our erstwhile host here, when I pitched you the idea of playing the witch, the amount of energy you put into like taking that concept and making it your own, making that character so much more interesting. It was a delight to see.
Oh, thank you. We never did tell the others much about like the development that went into it when we were discussing her, did we?
I don't think so, no. I spoke with everyone who played an NPC and had lengthy voice chats and video chats with each person, essentially to provide a crash course in the system, in Fate, and then also to get an idea of how each actor wanted to approach playing that character. So it was a really pleasant exercise in on what angle you wanted to come from. And I say that you, the general you, and then also you, Jasmine, and also you, Alana. You both played very memorable NPC characters / antagonists.
I tried. Laura and Bex did amazing jobs with theirs as well.
Yeah, I would definitely like to hear more about them. And if you guys are interested, I would be happy to share my process with the Sweet Witch, since I didn't get to use a whole lot of it, because again, Alice rocked her shit.
I for one would be interested to hear actually from both of you. We've heard from everyone else here about how they approach their characters. As two people who were kind of essentially given the template for a character and then had to figure out a way to build on top of it. I'd be interested to hear both of you and how you both broached it.
Essentially with the Sweet Witch, I was just kind of like, okay, so how did she get cursed like this? Because that was the whole idea. Basically, she was cursed with craving human flesh. Nothing else could satisfy her or nourish her at all. And I ended up kind of going into another grim fairy tale, the Juniper Tree. How many of you guys are familiar with this one?
I am not, which is surprising.
Never heard of it.
It's a very dark fairy tale.
And now it's time for IRTLDR.
Kind of starts with the standard evil stepmother thing, except she up and kills her stepson and sets it up that his sister thinks that she's responsible for it. And so they bury him in the backyard. Well, bury his bones in the backyard. They feed him to his father. And
we're just going all out, aren't we?
And
Connor.
This is like checking all the evil stepmom boxes.
yes.
Connor, it was supposed to be the Tempest, not Titus Andronicus.
I mean, no, do not blame Connor. This is all me. This is all me.
As with all games, all I can do is present something, and then the players will blow it up figuratively or metaphorically, or literally.
And long story short, basically there's this little bird that's just kind of gathering things from the village and is singing this song, which you guys did hear me sing while I was letting the witch die in the fire.
She stands watching the house burn. My mother, she murdered me, and then my father ate me, and then my sister Anne-Marie gathered up my broken bones and swaddled me in silken cloth to lay under the juniper. A pretty bird am I.
Collecting these items and killing the stepmother revives the little boy. I came up with this idea that his sister actually was just so desperate to bring him back that she essentially made a kind of Faustian deal about it, and unfortunately didn't realize that by consequence, the combination of that plus, the fact she did in fact witness her father doing a cannibalism, maybe even did one of her own in this version, I never did quite solidify that. Just the combination of all that ended up with her cursed with this, and she ended up isolating herself and just kind of losing it and just kind of resigning herself that this is her fate because she can't seem to fucking die anyway, so fine. And I ended up writing this whole thing where, because the way they describe the little boy in the fairy tale sounds an awful lot like he could be related to Snow White, so I came up with the idea that he ends up being her father, and I came up with this whole idea where she ends up eating the evil queen after...
Jazz, was there any fairy tale you didn't incorporate into this backstory?
Yes. But no
puppets.
It just kind of happened that way. I've said it before on this podcast. One of the most frustrating things about things like Once Upon a Time is that I love the concept of a connected universe with the fairy tales, and I'm always trying to kind of come up with them on my own. This just kind of happened this way, so there you go. Now the creepy song that freaked Sam out and made Addie grin like the Cheshire goddamn cat has been explained.
One of the interactions I liked, when you were still trapped in the burning building and Connor offered to Valjean that you can go back and save them, I'm like, well, I have to. Of course he would.
Wasn't that also the encounter that broke the stream because we asked Prospero to come along?
Yeah, that was something that was not expected. It's one of those things where it's like, as the GM, you should expect someone to be like, hey, pretty powerful NPC, why don't you come with us and help us deal with this problem? And there was no reason for Prospera not to come, basically. It's not like, if perhaps I should have been like, okay, so Laura, if they ask you to come, you have to be like, no, actually, I gotta go and prep the boat.
As players, we're always going to bring the NPCs with us, if we can. We're going to try.
And or Connor completely destroyed the NPCs way faster than we expected.
A little of column A.
And one of the things I really loved about that whole scene is how Valjean does still have so much sympathy for her, to the point where he's even praying for her soul as she dies. And also just the fact that he's all, it's up to God now. Like, you gave me the chance to leave. And I'm just like, you know what? Fuck this.
Meanwhile, Morgan Le Fay is just like, nope, you kill it with fire. That's how you deal with this.
You burned the witch.
We have found a witch. May we burn her?
Turned me into a newt. The first goddess was very interesting because she's the only NPC, both played by actors, who doesn't exist, because she was kind of a conglomeration that Connor and I came up with. She served the purpose as an obstacle in the heroes' path, and basically all that they were supposed to do was find a way to convince her that it mattered, that they stop the thief from screwing with the music of the spheres. The idea being that the first goddess dates back to the earliest human storytelling, and so therefore she's seen everything change over time, and she doesn't entirely understand that what the actual bad guy is doing could be a problem for creativity overall. And so literally all y'all were supposed to do was explain to her that no, really, this is bad, actually. And then she was gonna give you a blessing and send you on your way. And y'all decided to pick a fight.
So I think in the end, we kind of did just that, because the conversation went with, I think, pretty much all of us saying, well, we're here now and we feel this. We exist in this moment. And then when Valjean basically said, every one of those stories, the characters matter. And so I am going to take on the role of the defender of the multiverse and make sure that everyone gets to live out their stories.
Yeah, you made him into your white knight.
Which made sense, honestly.
It's not just that. Alice and Valjean worked together in a way that I did not expect, but really, really worked well. I loved that Alice became Cosette to Valjean, and Valjean became the White Knight to Alice. And it was just, if anything could have worked out better as like a two characters actually just meshing perfect, I don't think I've seen it in very many tabletop games. It's just really, really good.
That entire interaction as Morgan Le Fay was like getting worked up and like, how dare you deign to say that to me? And Titania was like egging them on. It's like, yeah, we can take him. I'm like, oh no, I'm seeing the writing on the wall. This is bad.
I think that was also the point when I was at my parents' house and they came home, they heard me yelling and they were like, is she okay up there? And they asked me afterwards, I'm like, yeah, I was just acting. I was really into the moment, man. I was in character.
It was so fantastic, because the thing was, like, Connor, I think you were still figuring out, you knew you wanted that last, not antagonist, but just, obstacle. And we were talking about it, and I suggested the idea of some kind of progenitor of all stories, because I knew that it would irritate the crap out of at least Sam and Addie, and that would be reflected in their characters because of the characters they'd chosen. And you mulled over it and made some excellent suggestions about where to go with it. And so basically, I wound up at one point where I basically told, because, okay, so you've got a group that's got Fairy Queen, a Witch Queen. Alice is also a Queen of Hearts.
Technically, she's not a Queen of Hearts. She's the Queen of Underland, which is the world through the mirror, through the looking glass.
Right, yeah.
She didn't obtain a crown in Wonderland from the card suites. Yeah. She obtained her crown by marching across the board as a pawn of white.
And then...
I'm sorry, this is like an actually moment. I'm just gonna adjust my glasses here and go like, actually.
You didn't get the points though because you didn't say actually.
Sam's right. Okay, and then, but so like I basically was saying to these three women who are queens in their own right, and another woman who is just escaped from being under the control of someone else, and said to them, you're all part of me, actually. And they blew up. And I literally had to sit there and go like, my one real combat ability here, because we weren't expecting this to be a combat character, was basically a ground pound. And I'm going, I'm not ground pounding the child. So I'm literally sitting there going, I don't want to actually have to fight any of these people, because that's not what the character's actually like for. And then I think it may have been Morgan Le Fay that was explaining that she and Titania were the ones that could feel the stories changing the most, but it was driving Titania crazy.
I think that there's something to be said for like the point of the module, and this is really more like maybe for Connor to confirm or deny, but it felt like the point of the module for me was that every variant of every story is important and good to exist, even if you don't personally like it. And so like I've been actually referring to my character Alice as Alice variant Musica or Alice variant Universalis, because she, by that point, especially by that point, she is not the Alice from the books. She has her own story now, been through this weird adventure where she saw all sorts of other things. She's interacted with at least one other Alice through the mirror on the wall, which was fantastic. I love the fact that by the end of this thing, Alice had reached through a mirror and jumped down a hole. I think that Alice is, in this moment, I think she just stamped her foot and basically said, no, but we're here now, right? Like, this is us. And so if you made it so that we're not allowed to have other Alices than the Alice that was in the book, I now could not exist. This story we're telling right now could not exist. There is no universe of stories.
Yeah, you essentially, you kind of hit that nail right on the head. We may not like every interpretation of a character. We're not obligated to, but we also can respect different interpretations of those characters. And by virtue of you all playing this game, and by virtue of the fact that it now exists within your memories, and it also exists in the form of the video that anyone can now watch at any time that they wish, for as long as YouTube exists, by virtue of the fact you all were involved in it and you were part of the story, those characters that you made, those interpretations also now exist essentially forever, because they exist at least within your memories, and they will then exist at least partially in the memories of anyone who saw it, or the memories of anyone who you told about it, which is very, very fun, because if someone was told about it, if you sat down with a friend who didn't watch like the 6.5 hours that we played for, and you tell them like, I was in this wild game and I played Alice from Alice in Wonderland, and here's what she did. The funny thing about it is that like their understanding of those actions as you tell it to them will also create a new, different version of Alice version Universalis, which is very fun to me personally as the GM and author. And that's the funny thing too, because you were all also the author. You all, in a sense, created this story. And when I say all of you, I mean everyone involved in this right now, including Alana and Jasmine, because you were all involved in the creation of the story, and therefore you essentially worked with me together to create essentially what is... Katie, honey, if you could confirm, do you think this would qualify as an egregore?
Okay, so an egregore is an esoteric/occult concept wherein a group of people are dedicated to an idea, and the theory goes that as they put their time and energy and imagination into creating said idea, that idea eventually becomes manifest in some form in the material world and can then go on to affect the material world. I listen to extremely weird podcasts, so it should not surprise anybody that I listen to a podcast called Weird Studies, which is fascinating and takes a very interesting look at art and culture. One of their episodes talks about the Beatles album Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band being an egregore because it was 4 people who had this very interesting concept in mind and just threw themselves into it. And yes, on some level, the egregore became real because it became an album. But then that album went on to be played constantly in the US and the UK, in people's homes and on the radio. You know, there are various singles that came out. Some radio stations, like when it first came out, would just play the entire album. And music nerds nerds will get into incredibly huge debates about whether or not Beach Boys' Pet Sounds or Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band by the Beatles was the more influential album. I'm firmly in the Beatles camp. But this album, whether or not you believe in the concept of egregores, this album did change popular culture. There's like no way to avoid that, even if you're looking at it just strictly through a pop culture lens. And so working on this together, as we all kind of had these ideas bouncing off of each other, and I was really struck by how, even though we were not in the same room, even though we can talk on Discord, but you can't really call somebody in like in the middle of the day and say like, hey, I got this really great idea on Discord, because we all have to work. But I was really struck by how, as the production came together and as the game itself went on, we all started to kind of vibe on the same level and create this thing that would go on to change at least us, if not viewers.
One of the things that I know I mentioned it earlier as well, but I don't think of myself as the best writer, quote unquote, but the scene that Valjean had between Dantes, I know we talked about it earlier, but if I were to ever write fan fiction, it would be me bending and crumpling those two books to because timeline wise it works out. They were in jail at around the same time. That takes place over roughly the same period of French history. These two people could interact, and the way that they dealt with their prison experiences were so very different, and the way that the Count seeks his vengeance was so callous, and the way that Valjean, it's antithetical. There's no way he could accept a thing like that, and just being able to explore that mind space, or indeed the scene with the Sweet Witch, of all the terrible people that Valjean ever met, the Sweet Witch would be the worst person, even considering the Thénardiers, they are the worst person, but I can't imagine them not forgiving them. I can't imagine them hating them and not giving them the opportunity to change. And just being able to explore this mind space and explore this character who ultimately does what Valjean does. He accepts this great personal sacrifice and willingly escapes into the sixth dimension and becomes unbound by time and space and whatever else happened to him at this point.
I love there was a moment where Valjean interacted with, I think it was on the boat after we escaped with the Count, but you got to moralize a little. And the thing is that is, Les Mis is a moralizing book, and Valjean is one of the most uncomplicatedly good guys in literature. He's complicated because he's got a whole lot of, the world isn't really kind to him, but he is at his core a good man, and he just needs that one reminder from the priest to make sure that he stays with the moral right. He tries to do the right thing in whatever situation he's in.
Yeah, and in my mind, Count of Monte Cristo, he goes through all these lengths and begins to poison a family, but he leaves the child. And it didn't occur to him that the child could die, and he doesn't really care. So I'm imagining in this context, could that be the voice in his mind being this version of Valjean being, it's hey, baby, don't be completely evil. It's fun.
I remember, we got smashed up by Moby Dick when we were on that ship. Were we on the Pequod? Because
I don't think
just being smashed by Moby Dick, because I remember the white whale part of it very clearly.
No, you were not on the Pequod, because I recall now you were on the Hispaniola.
Oh, right.
If I remember correctly, you were on the Hispaniola, yeah.
I was thinking about the white whale of it all, and that's a completely different story that involves revenge. So that's, if Edmond Dantes is in the middle between Valjean and Ahab.
I will say, you mentioned that. It is very funny to consider because, as with so many great things I've ever done creatively, it was completely unintentional, and I did not realize I'd done it until you brought it up.
Well, I've read the Count of Monte Cristo, and I know the play for Les Mis. I don't know the book. Justin was talking a lot about the book before we went into it, because I think how long
do you
did
like
it take for you to go
sewers?
through it?
I got 40% through it, and then I got distracted for 5 months, and then this happened, and then I read the rest of it. I gotta say, the play, the plot is the play. Unfortunately, it's only 30% of the book, and then Hugo will just go on a tangent for 20 pages about something else.
Let me tell you about Les Sewers. Let me tell you about this family's history with Napoleon Bonaparte.
Yeah, allow me to... it's seared into my mind. Valjean is leaving with Cosette, and they pass a door The door is made out of the bottom of a wagon that was at Waterloo. He then explains the history and battle of Waterloo over 147 pages.
Do you not remember the 7-minute aria to Waterloo in the show?
By the way, Jazz, how's your reading the brick going?
Oh god, I've fallen off the wagon there. I want to get back on it, but yeah, one thing I do want to say: have you all ever seen that post about ADHD storytelling? Is Les Mis just ADHD storytelling?
Yes.
It's just
If it is, Victor Hugo is like, writing, tangent about my special interest, go spend some time with one of the sex workers in Paris. Lather, rinse, repeat.
Basically.
The man fucked.
Yes, he did.
The first goddess, we created something in this as opposed to using characters that already existed, even if we went and changed them like Prospera or developed a bunch of additional backstory for them like the Sweet Witch.
One of the reasons I was putting together the game and finalizing each act in each setting and the characters the players would meet, and recognizing that it was very, very kind of Eurocentric, for want of a better word. I would say the characters kind of, their origins are very sort of like pan-European, you know, from sort of like Romano-British origins of, you know, Morgan Le Fay, and to, you know, Titania, who is, her origins can be found sort of across Europe as peoples moved. But long story short, it felt very Western European point of view, and ultimately I am European, and most of the fiction that I was exposed to growing up is European. It's very Western, but that's not where people come from, and it's not where stories originate. I knew that I wanted to do something that kind of like went even further back and tried to get to like the origins of stories and why we as a species needed to make them, if only so that we were able to figure out, if only so that we were able to tell ourselves the world works this way, so don't worry about it so much. But it was also going to be really, really, I had to tread very, very gently there, because I personally was reluctant in some ways to say too much about that character and about that first goddess, and I was struggling to really verbalize what the point of that was and what the point of that NPC was. So I was very grateful that I could have conversations with Alana to make sure that it didn't feel cheap, I guess is the first word that comes to mind. How did players feel about that?
It occurred to me after the fact that there are a lot of death goddesses throughout kind of all mythologies, well, many mythologies across the world. You've got like Persephone and earlier Proserpina, you've got Hel, you've got Ereshkigal, all of these other incredibly powerful death goddesses, and having a goddess who is ultimately where all things go, who is connected to everyone because everyone dies, and who is not yet really convinced that there is much purpose in allowing everything to continue because who cares? That actually kind of makes some sense to me as a sort of pan-theological amalgamation. And this didn't occur to me while we were playing because I was very much caught up in Alice's headspace and I wasn't really thinking about death at the time. But I kind of like that idea that there's a lot of people around the world who have throughout history come up with the idea that endings are sort of a kindness and not necessarily the worst thing.
I will say that when I was thinking about the character, particularly after we decided that I was going to be playing her, that was part of my thought process. But I was also looking at the prevalence of maternal figures in stories, both mythological ones and folktales and fairy tales and all the things that come, from those.
And mythological dualities of life and death, birth and endings.
And so that's why she wasn't really meant to be a nature goddess. She was very much supposed to be about people. She made people or they made her. That's where the connection is. And so, my goal was to say that she was representationally, she's the seed of the human instinct to tell stories, to explain things. So definitely, I don't recall how conscious I would have been of this at the time, but the idea of her being also kind of a death deity may have been kind of kicking around in the back there. And I'm actually you right back, because Proserpina is the Latin name for Persephone.
I just thought it was okay.
I get the point.
I appreciate it. Thank you for correcting me. I appreciate it.
But no, you do get deities associated with death that are female in some traditions across Africa, and I believe in Japan as well, and all over Norse mythology. So it's all kinds of stuff with that. But I hadn't thought of that.
I do think that there's like this risk that we take whenever we do these like universal stories type dealies. We can sit here overthinking the fact that someone pointed out to me about the new one that this is a very Eurocentric set of stories that we're picking. But like, I think at a certain point you have to just sort of, you don't want to get into like, well, I'm going to make someone pick a story that is not their own culture because I want to have that representation, because that's going to lead to a very inauthentic portrayal of that story. And you don't want to just be like, I'm going to go get this person who I don't really know and bring them into this because I want them to bring this perspective, because that leads to sort of like tokenism. And I admit that my personal stories get overrepresented in media. I don't want to speak for anyone who is not me, but like personally, one of my least favorite things is when like someone is going to include this or that thing without any understanding of the story that it's attached to, just because they think they should. So I think that it is a very Eurocentric story, and I think that I would like to include people who aren't of European backgrounds in this group, but I don't want to go seek people out for that reason alone, because that's a shitty thing to put on someone. I wouldn't want someone to seek me out for a D&D group because they want a trans woman or because they want a lesbian in their group, because that is just reducing me to one aspect of myself. And maybe other people can disagree. That's just my opinion.
Even just coming up with this concept of a unified Western canon is kind of a form of cultural colonialism, imperialism, hegemony, whatever you want to call it. But the way that we've mushed all these stories together so that German stories and English stories and Italian stories and French stories, they're all now solidified under the Western canon. And then technically we have the quote-unquote Eastern canon, but that's so often reduced to just Chinese and Japanese stories. So in that sense, universal storytelling is kind of just a Western concept in general, even when one considers that we are not as diverse a group as we probably should be for telling a story like this.
Turns out Joseph Campbell is full of shit. Stop listening to him.
Yes.
What I'm saying is, I think that the reason that we go to this idea of universal storytelling and the idea that stories have this web of connection across all these different cultures is because we are, in the end, social animals who want there to be connection. And for better or for worse, that does mean we seek out the familiar to do it. And so I think the best thing we can do is try to find ways to keep expanding the web and strengthening the strands of it.
So I think that it matters who's telling what story, and in our group, we have the people that we have. And so I could have very easily dug into my Indian background and decided to pull characters to play from there, but I'm an American. My dad was from India, but I'm pretty comfortable with Western storytelling, and I love it, right? Like, I love Eastern storytelling too, but I don't have to do it all the time. And the other thing is that it is true that in this, especially in this story, we are talking about mimetic storytelling.
Yeah.
The stories that build off of each other. There's this concept in languages, language families, of the Proto-Indo-European language, which is not a real language that we know existed exactly, but it is a possible language that we put together based on commonalities. differences between different language roots, language families, and there's so much that we have in common with other people around the world because sometimes things just sort of make sense. And so it makes sense to think about a sort of a root language that, and essentially it's the same thing as when people are looking for mitochondrial Eve or the origin of where did we actually come from as a species, like what's the root. The same kind of concepts that go into that are that like people sort of specialize and they change, and it's with isolation that things change further. But we have a more connected world than we've ever had before, and like historians notice that we have been more connected in history than we often give people credit for. The amount of movement across continents and across waters, we are continuously underestimating our past. So yeah, I don't think it's like a bad thing to think about that on a whole, and I don't think it's a bad thing to necessarily like stick to what we know when we're telling the stories. We don't want to take something that is from somewhere that we have no connection to, that we don't understand. That's appropriation. If we do understand it well, or we're connected to it in some way, it can become appreciation. But this is the thing, is that like it's not bad to play. It's generally good to play.
I'm Jewish, so I come from the whole problem there. And I've studied mostly on my own a lot of folklore and mythology, so I wouldn't say I'm an expert, but I have made sure to not just stick to Europe. And I was very careful, or tried to be, I hope I succeeded, when playing this character to try to stick to a more universal view of things, specifically so that I didn't wind up either underrepresenting the rest of the world that isn't Western Europe, trying to talk about things that I'm not super qualified to talk about. Like, I don't know very much now what we call South American folklore around the continent and stuff like that, and I would be vastly underqualified to talk about that, but that would be missing a whole massive chunk of humanity. And what I tried to focus on were the things that do seem to be, if not strictly universal, then very, very common. Like, every culture's got creation mythology of some form. I mean, as far as we're aware, every culture talks about why the sun rises and why the grass grows if they have grass.
Even if it's just many, it's still interesting.
Yeah, and so when Connor and I were developing this character, it was definitely something that was on my mind, and I know it was on Connor's as well, because we talked about this, that the idea was to handle this very carefully, with the knowledge that when I turned the camera on, it would be a white face talking. And even though the character is described as her appearance shifting, it's still a white face on camera, and we were aware of that, and that was something that we wanted to make sure that we were handled very carefully, and hopefully it worked. I don't recall getting any major complaints about it, which is nice, which doesn't necessarily mean we did it right. It just means no one told us we did it wrong. You know, it is definitely a problem.
There's something to be said for working with what you have.
Yeah.
The nature of stories is communication, like art is communication in a lot of ways. And people can't control what stories speak to them. They just have to have the opportunity to hear them in the first place. Like, I'm American, but I picked a French story. Well, my ancestors are Acadian. Does that make it all right? Like, okay, maybe I should have picked Paul Bunyan and his big blue ox. That would have been helpful. But, you know, I don't care about Paul and his big blue ox, but I do care about these stories that I do spend a lot of time with, working with a lot of time and mental focus on trying to tease out why these stories are interesting to me, or why they have stuck around for so long. Like, with the majority of these stories, they're centuries old at this point, and they're still being told, they're still being readapted, they're still being conveyed to each other because something about them is still important. Like, again, not to keep going back to the character, like, you know, the story of Valjean it touches a lot of people because it's about persecution, it's about injustice, it's about the poor, it's about people who try to make a better world and fail, it's about people who suffer needlessly, and all of those themes are in this book, and you can follow that rabbit hole down with any story that speaks with you. But, again, these stories gets retold. These stories stick around for a reason.
And it's interesting, Justin, how you were saying that people can't choose really what stories resonate with them, because I've always been fascinated medieval history, specifically medieval British history. And I do have some British ancestry. It is quite far back. The reason that I love those stories so much is because it allowed me to look on a landscape that had, very mundane explanations. Why are there so many Tudor houses? Because a whole bunch of people during the 20s had a whole bunch of money and they decided to build a whole bunch of fanciful homes. But when you're young, you can make the world magical through the stories that you read. And by doing that, I think, for me anyway, it makes life a lot more fun. And that was one thing that I appreciated about this game, is that there were no roles assigned, and there was nobody saying like, well, are you sure that you can represent, let's see your 23andMe profile here, let's see if you're qualified. Now, in saying that, I'm very much aware that as somebody who is interested in many different types of stories and is interested in Japanese culture, actually, I studied abroad there for a brief time, 3 months, but my area of specialization when I went to college was actually Japanese, more because I reached my senior year and my advisors realized, you've taken a lot of these classes and you don't really have time to minor, do you? So we'll just slap that. But Japanese myth and folklore is fascinating to me, but at the same time, I understand that as an outsider looking in, I will not have the cultural context necessary to bring the nuance and the knowledge that that particular, mythology deserves.
It's also worth noting that, when we say Western mythology and Western storytelling and that sort of thing, there's a reason why people who grow up in America are exposed very, very early on, from a very young age, to English stories, to French stories, to German stories, to all of these European things, because America is an amalgam country built by stealing a whole bunch of land from people and pushing them out, and then filling the place with people from Western Europe mostly. And those kind of stories ended up taking over our cultural backdrop. And even further than that, if you are a British child growing up in England, you will learn stories from France, you will learn stories from Germany, you will learn stories from Spain. And the reason why is because you have a tight, interconnected set of peoples there that have interacted over thousands of years, and they have a shared history, not just a distinct history. So when you say, I do have some English heritage going way, way back, well, your culture, the culture that you grew up with here in America, is also very tightly related to the cultures that exist along the western coast of Europe. They're not really separate.
This idea that America doesn't have a culture all its own is in itself kind of playing a hand in white supremacy when you think about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of a belonging, right? Who do we belong to? And
Exactly.
American culture and European culture are kind of very, very similar, except in that Americans think in hundreds of years and Europeans think in thousands.
For me, too, I think there's a little bit of a personal edge to it, because my maternal grandmother is Mexican-American. And when I was growing up, by token of that connection among my peers, especially, when we were quite young, I then became responsible for answering all of their questions about Mexico, which I had no context for and could not answer because I grew up an hour south of Cleveland, thereabouts.
It's weird, right? It feels so weird to, yes, you identify with this part of yourself, but you also feel such a weird disconnect from it.
Yeah, and so, I could have said, well, I'll take a look at Mexican folklore or Mexican myth or this and that. But again, Addie, to your point, because I grew up in America and in an area of America that was and still is predominantly white. We are slowly changing over, thank goodness. The town that I grew up in got their first Thai restaurant in 2020. We're suffused in this. If you grow up in America, that's just kind of how things are. And hopefully they are changing as we kind of realize, hey, America is not just, people from this select group of, and I put it in quotes, acceptable countries. And the only reason I say that is because, if you look at 19th century America during the Great Immigrations, there were a whole bunch of people that were not really considered worthy, we'll put it that way. People from Eastern Europe, for example.
My people.
Yeah,
Actually,
exactly.
specifically. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and so is
I have Italian and Irish ancestry, and my mom's like, you know, at one point we were considered undesirable people of color. I'm like, Mom, don't. Just don't.
Oh, God.
If anything, that should make you more sympathetic to it.
But
also, like, yes, we absolutely need to decolonize how we tell stories, but as I think has been made very clear, trying to take these stories that we don't necessarily have a huge attachment to for the sake of trying to bring them more to light, that's the wrong move. You need to find people who do have a connection to it, basically. The answer is to have more voices.
There's also the issue of, we get a lot of people theorizing on how, like, when people of one culture tell a story that belongs to another, they often get it wrong. And that can work in two ways. One is that they make it too samey, which is all of the recorded stuff about Norse mythology that we have that is very much filtered through an early Christian lens, because that's the person who is writing it down. But we also get stuff where it's too othered, and that's where you get like Indiana Jones and the second Indiana Jones movie with the cult of Kali there. And the thing is that I was raised in America, and my mother is Catholic. I was raised Catholic. So my connection to Hindu mythology is tenuous at best, but I've learned some of it as a defensive kind of thing, because it's like, sometimes I'm the only Indian in the room and I just sit there and I go, she doesn't just fucking kill people. They're gonna belong to her in the end. It doesn't matter when and how they die. Like, so it's like...
Yeah, but in conclusion, Your Honor, assimilation's a hell of a drug.
Yeah, it really is.
Well, and then one of the things that's weird, I grew up in the United States. My grandparent level is where people came from elsewhere. And as I said, some earlier than that, but I was raised reasonably enmeshed in a certain version of Judaism, and that comes with stories, and I was often the only Jew in the room. And, you know, some of the stuff that I learned on my own, not because I was necessarily interested in it, because liturgical Judaism doesn't interest me. Possibly polytheistic matriarchal culture sitting underneath is what I'm interested in, because I am a pagan Jew, apparently. And I have done this for this podcast. It doesn't bother me when people are asking questions and saying things in good faith. But like, sometimes it can be exhausting to be like the representative of an entire culture. So that experience kind of dovetailed into like, how the hell do we do this character in a way that's not going to like be a mess? Minimize the potential for accidentally appropriative statements or behavior.
Well, damn, that got deeper than I expected this to.
We're talking about things that we love. We're always going to go deep.
Oh, yeah, no, absolutely. And
We got so philosophical.
We did. And one of the things I love about this podcast is that one minute we're going to be making stupid jokes, and the next minute we're going to be talking about things that actually mean something. But damn, I almost feel weird even bringing up like what were some really great surprises from this story after all of that, but we'll make it work.
I still like to think about that ending thing. I can't remember what the exact numerical roll was, but we didn't even end up using Alana's gift because Katie gave me this great handoff, and then I, as Christine, like created my own music or something.
Yes.
I remember this euphoric feeling as we were going through it, and my mic clipped out or something because of how Zoom's audio settings work. So I started to sing and then realized that the mic wasn't allowing people to hear me sing. I'm like, wait, this is better because now the music can sound like anything. And so I just had this euphoric look on my face as I was like pantomiming singing.
It was so beautiful because Christine kind of in that moment became the culmination of like, this is why Christine is here. It's to sing the music of the spheres. It was so good. Yeah, that was a surprise to me too.
It gave her the heroine arc I always wanted this character to have, because Sam and I have talked about this a lot. Like, we both adore this character and think she often gets a bad rep in just discussions of her story, and it was just so wonderful seeing
empowered women empowering other women.
And music. You saved storytelling, and that is so fucking rad.
And that was something that I had not planned. If we go back briefly to the idea that we were all creating something that went beyond just us, that thought was not me going, I wonder how I can leverage my stats, or I wonder how I can like leverage the moment. I was just like, I had this idea, and before I could even like signal to Connor or anything else, I'm just having one of those wonderful experiences that I've had before at the tabletop, where all of a sudden I'm hearing my voice come out of my mouth. I'm like, what's going on? What? I'm not that smart. Where did that come from? So I was just as surprised as anybody else at that point.
So, Connor, when Sam chose Christine as her character, and you can of course say the magician never reveals his secrets, but had you planned for her to potentially sing the spheres back into alignment? Because that one got me too, because of course I was watching, and I was just like, oh, this is perfect. It's like it was written to be this way. Was it?
Not at all. No, in no way. I had written down, I actually pulled up my game notes, and I have the notes here for the final act of the game, and it's half a page, and that is the case for all of the acts actually, with the exception of the island, because more kind of went on there, and like basically, yeah, the final act was essentially, I have GM'd for a long time, and I am notoriously lazy as a GM. I do not like to do an awful lot of work. I used to do a ton of work, and now I just don't like to do it. So my approach is set a scene and then let the players go crazy on it and just respond as best I can to whatever happened. When the characters were decided, the characters themselves did not have a massive impact on how I set those scenes. They kind of helped inspire it somewhat, because it told me, number one, don't choose any stories that those characters are from, because that would be really weird and awkward. Make sure that they're always out of place. Make sure that they always feel like fish out of water to a certain degree. But no, like to be blunt, I had absolutely no intention. It did not enter my mind for a moment that the story should end with Christine basically singing the music of the spheres back into existence, placing the music back into its place where it should be through an act of cooperative creation by members of the party. But I think it's an extension of an idea that I kind of quite enjoy myself, which is that when you're telling a story or when you're writing a story, you cannot dictate to the characters how they are going to respond or what they are going to do. At a certain point, you will have developed the characters enough that they will tell you how the story ends. And I've had that experience as a writer, and I've had that experience as a GM, and this was definitely one of those moments. It was one of those great moments where everything kind of comes together and the universe like determines that seemingly random choices that were made, you know, Sam choosing to play that particular character in that particular way at that particular time, and me placing the scenario in place in that particular manner, resulted in a question. I think that, and Sam, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think throughout that whole game I felt like Christine was asking a question of herself of like, why am I here? Because the other characters had skills or abilities or backgrounds that kind of put them, perhaps, it kind of made more sense that, the author would pick those particular people out of creation and send them on this adventure. But Christine, perhaps less so. And so I think you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think Christine had that question, and just by virtue of you all playing those characters, the story ends with Christine finding the answer to that question. Why is Christine here? Because only Christine could have sung that song and played that role.
It was definitely something that I was interrogating. Like, I remember when we were in the prison, Christine, she used that one skill to be like, oh, help me, I'm a swooning damsel. But then in the Sweet Witch encounter, she was like, oh god, I'm useless, I am so out of my depth. What am I doing here? And then the encounter with the goddess, it was just nervous breakdown time again, because baby girl's been through a lot. But yeah, that one moment when it's a moment where she's choosing to sing for all the people she's trying to save, which Christine Daae very much plays the martyr card when she needs to, but this was also a moment of singing for herself and singing the own song. And I know Addie was also a big fan of how I used the mirror as Christine's exit, because it was a self-actualization thing for me.
Deciding to be the master of your own destiny was just It's a beautiful story. I love it when you see characters that are filled with doubt. And in this particular crew, we had at least 3 out of 5 of us were just questioning ourselves. Was not really, like, Alice isn't going to question herself. She's full of pride, and she's full of, like, nobody's going to sit there and go, like, make Alice think, why would I be the one to be here? Like, what is important about me? No, she's very self-important. Titania would be egotistical to that extent. I have a feeling that Morgan would not really question, like, I'm here because I'm a powerhouse. Like, it's pretty hard to not...
We had 3 tanks! 3 tanks! 4 if you count Valjean!
I think Valjean would also be a tank for sure, but Valjean would probably question why me. I was also going to say that the thing that Christine is special in that moment, because in choosing to build her own story, she gets to end cap this on 2 really, really high notes that address the very core of the module. And one of the things about, like, the question of why me is because if it were somebody else, the story would be about them, and they might be asking the same exact thing. But that's just it. It's circumstance, right? You're here because you are. And once you are, there's no point in that. It's just, what can I do that only I could do? And so maybe we could have gotten our way through this final conflict with an entirely different crew of people. Probably we would have. But Christine was here now, and this is what Christine can do. And it turned out to be the exact right thing. And I think that's, like, a really, really incredible, like, message to send to people, is that, like, right now you're here. This is what you are dealing with. What can you do to make it yours? I just think in that moment, Christine was the protagonist. And it was awesome.
At the very least, the heroine. And again, that was part of what made that ending so thrilling to me. Because again, one of the beautiful things about being able to take these characters and just play with them is to kind of give them the justice that perhaps the narrative, or even just how society sees them, doesn't give them. And so, like we said, like, Christine is often just seen as a swooning damsel, or, as Sam put it, the bodice ripper self-insert. And in this one moment, she was anything but. And I think that's neat. And I also just think it's neat that all of these characters you would not have expected were able to come together and save the world. I think it's just really uplifting.
Christine Daae, icon.
Well, she was always an icon.
You fucking know it.
The reading of that section from The Tempest that Laura Crone did was very nice. Like, it's difficult to incorporate parts from scripts, or, you know, we can't keep the books in their entirety in our minds, so being able to incorporate, like, that sort of speech at that time, I felt that was a good moment.
Yeah, no, definitely shout out to Bex and Laura for their parts in this. Musica was kind of one of a few things that finally pushed me over the edge to even start this podcast. Second being Sam starting their own, because it just further reiterated how much like I said, I love seeing what we can do with the characters that belong to everyone. I love seeing them interact in new ways. I love seeing them being portrayed in new ways, because I think it's just part of this grand storytelling tradition that no matter how hard the corporations try, they can't stop that. Like, no one needs permission to make things. We never did, and I feel like we're becoming more and more cognizant of that, and I, as a storyteller myself, I think that's really important for us to remember that we can reclaim the narrative in our own ways. And I do think that's part of what you were thinking there, Connor, right?
Yeah, I believe that sums it up pretty well.
All right. Who's got stuff to plug?
Well, since you already brought it up, I am the host of 6 Degrees of Star Wars, where we explore all the ways George Lucas's flagship franchise surrounds us, binds us, and penetrates us in the landscape of cinema. And of course, we have co-custody of Ire, the little droid who finds the connection between our 2 podcasts. So you can check out the podcast wherever pods are cast, and check out our respective Tumblrs.
All right, so at time of recording, this is not complete yet, but Worlds Elsewhere has a project coming up soon. Not our usual fare of a full stage show, but something we have done before. And then we are also We're doing Musica Universalis Volume 2, Regenerational Trauma.
I've got plans.
Surprise, dear listeners, this was a promotional podcast all along!
We are going to see a new adventure. I don't want to give away too much at this point, but we will see some old faces returning, some new faces in new places, and it is a fundraiser, the beneficiary to be determined.
Editor Jasmine here. It will be going straight to the Worlds Elsewhere Theater Company, so we can raise funds so we can do more programming and hopefully raise more money for good causes.
We will hope to see you all there soon.
And we'll probably be doing an episode for that as well.
Of course. And it's going to be an original Kids on Bikes module that I'm creating and homebrewing myself. This is my first time DMing. I'm very excited.
It'll be my first time playing this particular game, but having looked into it, I'm really looking forward to it. This system looks so cool.
Anyone else?
Yes, I got a Twitter, LSR42. I got a Tumblr, football and tuxedos with dashes between all the words. We are trying to get Fui, the D&D actual play that this is all based on, back off the ground. Remember all those characters you loved in Fui? They're back, pod form. But that's slow going because, wrangling schedules is difficult. But I'm hoping to get that out before the Musica Universalis too, but we'll see.
Stay tuned.
My plug is a standard XLR cable that goes with most microphones.
That running gag will never get old.
Katie and I are continuing to make games and do fun little things through our itch page, Third Country Press, and we're also both now on Blue Sky.
Yippee, hooray!
Hooray for us. We did
One
it.
more escape pod from Twitter.
I left Twitter and then I just didn't really find myself anywhere afterwards. I was just like,
See, I'm not leaving till the site burns down, and we will go into that when I put it.
I will leave if they try to make me spend money.
That too. All right, and I'm
Worlds
stopping
Elsewhere
this.
still has its account. It just isn't updated anymore. It's got a big thing saying, until they get their shit together, we're not going to be here.
I'm on Mastodon.
Yeah,
I don't use it very much. Well, I follow people on it, but so I mostly lurk Mastodon. But Pigs Flew on the Queer Party server, queer.party. That's an actual URL.
Well, as I've already implied, you can find me on Twitter, Tumblr, TikTok, and Blue Sky at Faye Riviera. You could also follow this podcast on Twitter at IER Podcast. And to reiterate, next Saturday, April 20th, we will be doing Musica Universalis 2. I am super excited for all of the characters involved and for what crazy shenanigans Sam has unfolding for us. Again, it will be a charity for the Worlds Elsewhere Theater Company itself. They are a 501c charity, so please consider donating because for me, this company really opened a lot of doors for me, helped make a good chunk of the friends I have on this podcast, and I really wanted to see it keep going. There's a lot of potential with this company to provide not just really good entertainment, but also providing a lot of support to causes that need it. It's kind of become a ray of hope in my eyes to hopefully being able to make the world an even slightly better place. And once you're done supporting them, if you still have it in your heart and your wallet, please consider donating to our Patreon, Ko-Fi, or even to support the show link below. And if you really can't support us financially, please, I understand. It still helps a lot if you spread the word about our show, if you rate us on the podcaster of your choice, leave us a review, anything to help us reach the next chapter of our story. And speaking of which, we are still planning on doing a Passover episode either on the 22nd or the 29th. And we are still hoping to cover the Prince of Egypt. We'll keep you posted on that. And remember, stories gain power in each retelling.
Yeah, much like the actual Musica Universalis, I think that went a little bit longer than any of us expected.